Little Ruby Maxwell snuggled into her stuffed toys. She lifted her head just a little and looked at the clock on her bedside table. 11:56 p.m. Almost Christmas Day. Just a few minutes. And yet, she hadn't heard Santa arrive. But she wasn't sleeping. Ruby held her torch in her left hand. Any noise she heard, she sat up, flicked on her torch and aimed. But there was nothing. Nothing yet, anyway. "I'm going to see Santa Claus," Ruby told her mother before she went to bed that evening. Her mother chuckled at the idea. "Ruby," she said, "Santa won't come if you don't go to sleep." But Ruby didn't believe that. And so here she was, sitting and waiting for a jolly fat man to slide down the chimney. From her bed she heard noises downstairs, but it was just the house settling. But then, she heard something. It sounded like footsteps. Someone was coming. Her mother? Probably not. Her mother had been so exhausted lately she wouldn't be awake at this time of night. But if it wasn't her mother, then... Santa? It had to be. Ruby sat up in her bed and switched on her torch. She shined the light through the crack in the open door. The footsteps sounded like they were getting closer, and closer, and closer, and closer. Someone was coming up the stairs. Ruby began to shake. Suddenly, she was terrified. But it was Santa, right? You didn't have to be afraid of Santa. In the light of her torch, a figure appeared. "Santa?" Ruby whispered. Her bedroom door was pushed open slightly. "Surely I don't look that fat in this coat," a voice called out. Ruby aimed her torch at the figure. It was a woman. Short, blonde hair and a long grey coat. This was not Santa. "Sorry to disappoint you, kid," she said, "but I am not Santa Claus." The doctor smiled. "Now, back to sleep, young lady. I'm very busy at the moment." She turned and ran back downstairs. "Wait," Ruby whispered. Ruby kicked off her blankets and ran after the doctor. The doctor, hurrying downstairs, reached into her pocket and pulled out a small beeping device. "If you're not Santa, then who are you?" Ruby whispered. "Why are you whispering?" the doctor asked. "Shh, my mum is asleep," Ruby said, pointing back upstairs. The doctor paid no attention and instead just waved her small beeping device throughout the house. It was dark. Downstairs was lit up by the moon's light, although barely visible. "Can you tell me who you are?" Ruby asked. The doctor stopped and swung around to face Ruby. Although it was dark, Ruby looked up at the doctor, staring down at her. "I'm so sorry," the doctor said. "I understand what you're probably thinking. A strange woman has just appeared in your home, and you want to know who she is and why she's here, right?" Ruby began to smile, just a little. "Kind of, yeah," she replied. The doctor kneeled down in front of Ruby and placed her device beside her. "My name is the Doctor. I'm an alien. I've appeared in your house on Christmas Eve because I'm hunting a shadow monster that is trying to stop Christmas and enslave this planet. Is that a good enough explanation?" Ruby's smile quickly disappeared. The doctor jumped to her feet and grabbed the beeping device off of the floor. Now, this young girl was suddenly terrified of two things: a strange, slightly crazy woman in her home, and apparently, a monster. The doctor ran into the kitchen, pointing the device in every angle. Ruby followed closely behind. "What is that thing?" she asked. "Ah, this is a Whovian energy detector. But something's wrong. It's not picking up anything." The doctor replied calmly, as if Ruby would just know exactly what that is. "A what?" Ruby asked. Poor little Ruby seemed so scared by this odd woman, and yet she felt so safe with her. She felt so intrigued with her. She felt so intrigued by her. With no reply to her follow-up question, Ruby sat down at the kitchen bench and decided to just watch the doctor instead. "Why are you looking for this monster?" Ruby asked. The doctor slowly lowered the device and turned to Ruby. Her demeanour had changed, which began to frighten Ruby. "This creature," the doctor said, "it took my friends, and I've been hunting it for a few days now." "Did this monster kill your friends?" Ruby asked. The doctor shook her head. No, it took them to a temporal world, like a sort of prison." Ruby shrugged. "Then why are you in my house?" The doctor held up the detector. "Well, you see, this device tracked it to your home, but now there's no reading, so I don't understand what's happening." "Is this monster going to hurt me?" Ruby shivered. The doctor kneeled down beside her. "What is your name?" she asked. "Ruby." "Well, Ruby, I promise, this creature will not harm you. I'll make sure of that," the doctor replied. Ruby's face full of fear broke just a little as a smile appeared. The doctor stood up and continued waving the detector around the kitchen, but still nothing. Until the doctor raised the device towards the roof. A red light flickered out of control as the beeping grew more frequent. "What does that mean?" Ruby asked worryingly. The doctor's eyes widened. Finally. Ruby," the doctor said. "Yes, doctor?" "You said that your mum was asleep upstairs, right?" "Yes," Ruby replied. "Alone?" the doctor asked. Ruby hesitated. "Yes, why?" Ruby asked. "Well, it seems not," the doctor replied. Each step on the staircase seemed to suddenly creak. The doctor cautiously wandered up the stairs, followed closely by Ruby, guided by the beeping red light of the Sulfurian energy detector. A bright light shined out from underneath a bedroom door. "That's Mum's room." Ruby pointed at the door. The doctor pulled out her sonic screwdriver from her pocket. The closer she got to the door, the more the device began to beep. "Wait," Ruby whispered. "How do you stop a monster?" The doctor looked down and smiled. "Well, just press the big red button," the doctor winked. The doctor placed her hand on the doorknob. As she did, the light under the door instantly disappeared. Ruby took the doctor's hand and squeezed it tight. As the door creaked open, the doctor and Ruby peeked inside. "Mum!" Ruby screamed. Above the bed, Ruby's mother was floating in mid-air, but there was no monster anywhere. Ruby let go of the doctor's hand and tried to run towards her floating mother. "Stop!" the doctor shouted, grabbing Ruby's arm. The poor little girl began to cry. "It's here," the doctor said. The doctor looked down at the detector in her hand, beeping out of control. "Oi!" shouted the doctor. "Show yourself, you coward!" A strange shadow ran across the walls before stopping and disappearing beside the windows. "Come on! Scared, are ya?" the doctor shouted. Ruby couldn't take her eyes off of her mother, still floating above the bed in a paralysed state, as if she was in some sort of deep sleep.
"You think you scare me?"
A deep voice called out from nowhere. The doctor looked around, but she couldn't tell where the voice had come from. "Well, come on then," she shouted. "Reveal yourself." A light began to appear beside the window. The doctor ushered Ruby behind her as a cloaked figure began to manifest.
"So you are the one that has been hunting me?"
the creature growled.
"I was wondering when you would finally catch up with me."
The figure wore a dark cloak. Its arms were twisted, disturbing to look at. They looked broken, but it was the face that really seemed to frighten Ruby. The creature's face was dark green and covered in cuts, as if someone had just slashed it with a knife. "Ruby, meet a Sulfurian warlord, a cowardly race that travel the universe thinking they can take whatever they like," the doctor explained. "It kind of looks like the Grinch," Ruby whispered. The doctor smiled. "You know what? I think you're right."
"Enough nonsense. I must feast,"
the Sulfurian shouted. He turned back to Ruby's mother. "Stop," the doctor shouted. "From Protocol 847 of the Shadow Proclamation, I order you to stop."
"You think you scare me with Shadow Proclamation? You are wrong."
The Sulfurian raised his twisted hand at Ruby's mother, and suddenly she vanished. "Mum!" Ruby screamed. "Stop this!" the doctor shouted. "Let her go!" "Where's my mum? Doctor, where did she go?" Ruby screamed. The Cypherian fell to its knees as beams of light radiated up and down its arms. The doctor swung around to Ruby. "It's okay," the doctor said. "She's okay. Like my friend, she got teleported to a prison world. It's okay, she's alright. She's alive. But listen to me, we have to hurry. It's re-energizing. Ruby, you need to tell me. Why was it here?" the doctor asked. "What?" Ruby replied. "This creature, it feeds off of sadness and attacks the vulnerable. So I need to know, why was it here?" the doctor explained. Ruby slowly lowered her head as her eyes began to tear up. "Why you? Why your mother? Oh, I don't understand. Wait, Mum, but there's Mum and there's Dad. But hey, yes, what about Dad? Unless..." The doctor stopped herself. Oh, Ruby, I'm so sorry," the doctor said. Ruby burst into tears. "It's our first Christmas without him," she sobbed. The doctor wrapped her arms around Ruby and held her close. "I promise you, Ruby, I will get your mum back," the doctor said. Ruby nodded as tears streamed down her face.
Now for my next meal, the child."
The Cypherian stood up again as the doctor swung around, standing directly in front of Ruby. "Stand down," the doctor growled.
Oh, I don't think so. The human race will be obliterated one by one.
The doctor slowly reached into her pocket and pulled out the detector. "If you want Ruby, you'll have to go through me first," the doctor shouted.
Yeah, fine.
A stream of light shot out over the doctor, and suddenly, she was lifted into the air. "Stop it!" Ruby screamed. The doctor dropped her sonic screwdriver and the Cypherian energy detector onto the floor.
Oh, a Time Lord. How scrumptious.
Ruby scrambled onto the floor and grabbed the doctor's belongings.
So many sad memories inside this pathetic little head.
As the doctor was being consumed by the Cypherian, it began to see the sadness that the doctor had inside. It began to see everyone and everything that she had ever lost.
Goodbye, Doctor. It's like a kitchen. I'll be off then. Where am I? Hello, Raggedy Man. Good night.
Ruby pointed the sonic screwdriver at the Cypherian, but it did nothing. This was it. The doctor was going to be taken too, and then the creature would come for Ruby. Ruby looked at the Cypherian energy detector in her hand, still beeping and still flashing red. And suddenly Ruby thought back to what the doctor had told her. Press the big red button. Ruby looked up at the floating doctor. It looked as if her face was being sucked from her head.
I've never taken a Time Lord before, and I tell you what, you taste rather scrumptious. Your sadness is amusing.
And with no hesitation, Ruby did exactly what the doctor had told her to do. She pressed the big red button.
What is happening?
The doctor stood over the Cypherian as he crumbled onto the floor. His chest began to crack and light poured out. "I think you've just been defeated by an 11-year-old girl," the doctor chuckled. The doctor swung around to Ruby and took the device from her hands. The poor girl looked terrified. Her face was as white as a sheet and her hands were shaking. The doctor kneeled down beside her. "Ruby," the doctor said, "it's okay. You did it." Ruby looked into the doctor's eyes and slightly smiled.
What have you done to me?
The doctor stood up and turned to the Cypherian. "Oh, just a simple bio-optic dimensional teleportation field," the doctor replied. She looked over her shoulder at Ruby. "A what?" Ruby asked. "Or as I like to call it, a good old switcheroo," the doctor replied. "I forgot to mention, it isn't just a detector."
You are going to lock me in my own prison for eternity?
"Isn't that exactly what you were going to do? To all of those people that you took?" the doctor asked. "To Ruby's mum? To my friends?"
This universe will burn over your name, Doctor.
"You are no longer a shadow of darkness," the doctor said.
Death will find you, Doctor, and so will the truth. So will the timeless child.
The Cypherian's body was almost completely absorbed by light. "Why did you say that?" the doctor asked. She had heard those words before. The timeless child. It was a mystery in the universe, and it scared her. "Tell me," the doctor shouted. The The light had absorbed the Zephyrian. This terrifying creature was gone. The doctor sat on the edge of Ruby's bed. "I can't sleep now. I just stopped a monster," Ruby said. The doctor chuckled. "You have to, otherwise Santa won't come." Ruby rolled her eyes. "You're right, Doctor," she groaned. "But thank you," the doctor said. "You saved my life. Well, actually you saved thousands of people." "What about my mum?" Ruby asked. "Will she remember?" The doctor shook her head. "Not really. Everyone was in a coma-like state. To them it'll just seem like a really bad nightmare." Ruby nodded and tucked her blanket in nicely. The doctor stood up and made her way to the door. "But wait," Ruby said, sitting up in her bed. "Yes," the doctor asked. "Why did it feed on sadness?" Ruby asked. "The sadness of others made it stronger," the doctor replied. "When you're sad and you're vulnerable, sadness is a gift. Don't reject it, embrace it. Use it as a reason to grow. A lot of people tend to forget, but sadness, it's a powerful thing." Ruby smiled. "Good night, Doctor," she said. "Merry Christmas, Ruby," the doctor replied. And with that final goodbye, Ruby closed her eyes as the doctor closed the bedroom door. The doctor walked out into the empty street, lit up by Christmas lights on almost every house. It looked absolutely beautiful. But the thing that really caught the doctor's eye was one little light at the end of the street, the TARDIS. "You alright, Doc?" Graham called as he stepped out from the TARDIS door. The doctor smiled and ran to him. "You're back. All of you?" the doctor asked. Graham nodded. "Yaz and Ryan are inside getting a bottle of champagne." "Champagne?" the doctor asked. "Yeah, we're going to have a toast. To Grace. First Christmas without her," Graham replied. The doctor hugged him. "We're okay, Doc. Bit sad, but we're okay." The doctor pushed the TARDIS doors open. "Merry Christmas," she said. Graham smiled. "Merry Christmas, Doc." "You know," the doctor said, "I'm already thinking of plans for New Year's. I know a spectacular fireworks show in space."
Hello, this is Sylvester McCoy here, Doctor Who number 7. I want to say, Whovians, don't forget to subscribe to Liam Comley. There's a new video every week. And you don't have to be comely to watch it. You can be uncomely too. Bye.
Thanks for watching this week's brand new video, Whovians. If you haven't already, make sure you give it a thumbs up down below. And like the doctor just said, subscribe. There's a brand new video every single Friday. And if you haven't already, follow me on social media for some behind the scenes photos and videos, and of course more Doctor Who content. I'm Liam and I'll see you guys next week. Bye everyone.